Des Moines, February 1955. An editorial appears in the Des Moines Register that will change the course of agricultural history. Lawrence Soth, the paper's editorial writer, has done something unthinkable. He has invited the Soviet Union to send a delegation to Iowa. "We promise to hide none of our secrets," Soth writes. "Let the Russians see how we do it." Soviet spies translate the editorial and place it on Nikita Khrushchev's desk within days. To everyone's astonishment, including the State Department's, the Soviet premier accepts. But there is a deeper story behind this invitation. Just weeks earlier, Khrushchev had delivered a speech to the Communist Central Committee demanding an 8-fold increase in Soviet corn production. He wanted an Iowa-style corn belt in the Soviet Union. The premier had seen the statistics. American farms produced abundance, while Soviet collective farms produced scarcity. The solution seemed obvious. Copy the Americans. Copy their hybrid seeds, their methods, their miracle crop. What Khrushchev didn't understand was that he was about to attempt the largest agricultural technology transfer in Cold War history and ignore every warning that came with it. The irony would prove devastating. The same system that mocked American agriculture as capitalist exploitation would become desperate to replicate it. The same ideology that rejected Western genetics as bourgeois science would import Western seeds by the thousands of tons. This is the story of how Soviet pride met American corn, and how one man's obsession with a crop he barely understood would lead to bread riots, secret massacres, and ultimately his own downfall. The Soviet delegation arrived in Iowa in the summer of 1955, officially hosted by Iowa State University. They had come to study American agriculture, following Khrushchev's acceptance of that audacious newspaper invitation. But the delegation's carefully planned itinerary was about to be hijacked by a man who had never waited for permission in his life. Roswell Garst was watching. The Iowa farmer and seed company executive had built Garst and Thomas into one of America's largest hybrid corn operations. He had developed his first hybrid seeds in 1930, spent years traveling the Midwest, convincing skeptical farmers that this new technology would transform their yields. Now, he saw an opportunity that official channels would never provide. Garst intercepted the head of the Soviet delegation and made him an offer. Forget the university tour. Come see a real operation. The next morning, while Iowa state officials waited for their guests, Vladimir Matskovich climbed into Garst's car and simply drove away. The Soviets returned home with a 400-page report on Iowa corn. Garst's methods stood out above everything else. Within weeks, Garst found himself in Moscow, sitting across from Nikita Khrushchev himself. The two men discovered an unexpected kinship. Both came from peasant backgrounds, both understood soil and livestock and the brutal economics of feeding nations. But their exchange revealed something deeper about the Soviet predicament. Garst asked Khrushchev how the Soviets could know so little about American agriculture when they had easy access to farm journals, yet they had managed to steal the atomic bomb. Khrushchev laughed and raised 2 fingers. "It only took us 2 weeks," he said. "You locked up the atomic bomb, so we had to steal it. When you offered us information about agriculture for nothing, we thought that might be what it was worth." The next day, the Soviets ordered 5,000 tons of hybrid seed corn. But Gast wasn't finished. He delivered explicit warnings that would prove prophetic. Grow the corn only in southern regions where the climate resembles Iowa. Ensure sufficient stocks of fertilizer, insecticides, and herbicides. The seeds alone meant nothing without the complete system. 4 years later, Khrushchev visited Gast's farm in Coon Rapids, the only private citizen he met besides President Eisenhower during his entire American tour. 600 journalists descended on the quiet Iowa farm. Food tasters sampled every dish an hour before lunch. Gast, overwhelmed by the media circus, threw silage at reporters who crowded too close. Amid the chaos, Khrushchev made an admission that should have given his planners pause. Iowa corn, he conceded, was superior to Ukrainian corn. The seeds Gast sold to the Soviets were the product of a scientific revolution that Soviet ideology had systematically destroyed. Understanding why the corn campaign failed requires understanding what happened to Soviet genetics decades before Khrushchev ever dreamed of an Iowa-style corn belt. Trofim Lysenko had ruled Soviet agricultural science since the 1930s. A plant breeder with no formal genetics training, he had risen to power by promising Stalin miraculous crop yields through methods that rejected everything Western science had learned about heredity. Lysenko despised the concept of inbreeding, the very foundation upon which hybrid corn production rested. American hybrids were created by crossing carefully inbred parent lines to produce vigorous offspring. To Lysenko, this was bourgeois pseudo-science. Under his direction, Soviet hybrid corn programs based on American models were halted in the mid-1930s. Research facilities were not merely closed, they were destroyed. Scientists who defended Mendelian genetics faced imprisonment or worse. For 30 years, Soviet agricultural research existed in what Khrushchev himself would later call darkness. This meant that when 5,000 tons of Iowa seed corn arrived in Soviet ports, the collective farms receiving them had no institutional knowledge of how to grow them. Hybrid corn is not simply a superior seed. It is the visible tip of an invisible system requiring specific inputs, specialized knowledge, and supporting infrastructure. American farmers understood that hybrid corn demanded nitrogen-rich fertilizers in precise quantities. It required herbicides to control weeds that would otherwise choke young plants. It needed insecticides to protect against pests that had evolved alongside the crop for centuries. Soviet collective farms had none of these in sufficient quantities. The statistics revealed the gap in brutal clarity. The United States possessed 35 million tons of fertilizer for 118 million hectares of farmland. The Soviet Union possessed 20 million tons for 218 million hectares. American farms had nearly 3 times the fertilizer concentration, but the knowledge gap proved even more devastating. Collective farm workers had never been trained in corn-specific cultivation techniques. They lacked equipment designed for corn's particular requirements. Supply chains for the necessary chemicals simply did not exist. None of this tempered Khrushchev's enthusiasm. Corn could grow almost anywhere, he declared in 1954, despite lacking any evidence for such a statement. Local officials, terrified of disappointing the premier, began planting corn in regions where it had no chance of survival. Traditional crops that had fed Russia for centuries were pushed aside. Wheat fields became cornfields. Rye gave way to the queen of the fields. The displacement would prove catastrophic. The propaganda machine operated at full capacity. Soviet authorities commissioned over 100 different poster designs, printing them in tens of thousands of copies and distributing them from Moscow to the remotest collective farms. Newspapers devoted endless columns to the miracle crop. Television aired commercials featuring animated corn characters and cheerful chefs promising that corn would guarantee health and longevity. Children's cartoons celebrated the golden stalks as heroes of socialist agriculture. Corn became the queen of the fields, the miracle worker that would deliver Soviet citizens from scarcity into abundance. Khrushchev himself embraced the identity his obsession had created. "I am a kukuruznik," he declared, using the Russian word for corn enthusiast. In 1955, the nickname carried pride. Within years, it would become a term of mockery, whispered in bread lines. The initial results seemed to vindicate every promise. Favorable weather blessed the 1955 and 1956 growing seasons. Corn acreage exploded from 4.3 million hectares to 18 million in a single year. Golden stalks rose across the Soviet landscape. Khrushchev toured the fields, awarded medals to farmers, and pronounced the campaign an unqualified triumph. He had misinterpreted luck as vindication, mistaken weather for wisdom. But the harvests told a different story than the propaganda. Across vast stretches of the Soviet Union, the crops were a sorry sight. Plants failed to mature in the short growing seasons of northern regions. Stalks grew stunted and worthless in soil that lacked the nutrients corn demanded. Iowa seeds needed warmth and long summers. Siberia offered frost and failure. Local officials understood the consequences of disappointing the premier. They began reporting yields that existed only on paper. Farmers slaughtered their breeding herds to meet meat production quotas, artificially inflating statistics while destroying future capacity. The system incentivized lies and punished truth. The cruelest irony emerged from the campaign's central logic. Khrushchev had promoted corn as livestock feed that would increase meat and dairy production, but corn displaced the hay and fodder crops that had traditionally sustained Soviet animals. The result was a 30% reduction in animal feed, the precise opposite of the intended effect. Roswell Gast watched from Iowa with mounting frustration. Every warning he had delivered was being ignored. Soviet agriculture is 15 years behind the needs of the growing Soviet population, he observed bluntly, while American farmers are 15 years ahead of their country's needs. By the early 1960s, food shortages had become undeniable. Khrushchev blamed the careless attitude of local leaders. He could not admit that the failure was systemic. The reckoning arrived on June 1st, 1962. The Soviet government announced price increases of 25 to 30% on meat and butter. For workers already struggling with shortages and stagnant wages, the announcement felt like betrayal. At the Novocherkassk Electric Locomotive Works, laborers walked off the job that same day. By June 2nd, thousands of demonstrators had gathered. They marched toward the Communist Party headquarters in the city's center, carrying Soviet flags and portraits of Lenin. Their banners demanded the basics that the corn campaign had promised to deliver: bread, meat, butter. The workers believed they were exercising rights the revolution had guaranteed them. Soviet troops opened fire on the unarmed crowd. At least 22 people died in the streets. 87 more were wounded. In the aftermath, authorities arrested 116 participants. 7 were executed. The massacre was buried under absolute secrecy, erased from Soviet records until Glasnost finally exposed the truth in 1988. The workers of Novocherkassk had paid with their lives for promises written in propaganda posters. The following year brought drought. The 1963 harvest plummeted to 97 million tons, down from the 1958 peak of 122 million. Collective farms that had abandoned traditional grains for corn now had neither. The Soviet Union faced a choice its ideology had insisted would never come. For the first time since the Second World War, the Soviet Union purchased grain from abroad. Canada signed an agreement for 5.3 million tons of wheat in September 1963. American sales followed months later. The nation that had promised to bury capitalism now depended on capitalist harvests to feed its people. Khrushchev would later confess in his memoirs what everyone already understood. Corn was discredited as a silage crop, he wrote, and so was I. On October 14, 1964, the Central Committee removed him from power. Agricultural failures ranked prominently among the charges. The damage outlasted his leadership. Throughout the remaining decades of Soviet rule, the country never escaped dependence on imported grain. Precious metals mined in Siberia flowed westward to pay for American wheat. The corn campaign had not merely failed, it had permanently weakened Soviet agriculture. Yet the friendship between the Iowa farmer and the deposed premier endured. Gast and Khrushchev exchanged letters until both men died, congratulating each other on holidays, reminiscing about corn and cattle. Khrushchev wrote more letters to the American farmer than he ever wrote to President Eisenhower. In the end, the Kukuruznik found more kinship with a capitalist seed salesman than with the system he had served. The corn campaign revealed a truth that Soviet ideology could never admit. Agriculture isn't just about seeds and soil. It's about systems, the invisible networks of knowledge, infrastructure, incentive, and freedom that make innovation possible. Gast had tried to transfer more than hybrid seeds to the Soviet Union. He had tried to transfer an entire way of thinking about farming. But central planning couldn't replicate what free markets had built over generations. The hybrid corn that thrived in Iowa was the product of decades of experimentation by thousands of independent farmers, each learning from failure, each sharing success. Soviet collective farms had no such mechanism. When corn failed in Siberia, no one dared report the truth. When local officials falsified yields, no market corrected the lie. When Khrushchev demanded the impossible, the system delivered only pretense. The superpower that launched Sputnik and built nuclear arsenals couldn't grow corn. Not because Soviet scientists were less capable than American farmers, but because the Soviet system systematically destroyed the conditions under which agricultural knowledge could develop and spread. Lysenko had purged the geneticists. Central planning had crushed local initiative. Fear had silenced honest reporting. Khrushchev's corn crusade was never really about corn. It was about whether a command economy could import capitalism's results without adopting capitalism's methods. The answer, written in failed harvests and breadlines and the blood of Novocherkassk, was no. But what do you think? Could the corn campaign have succeeded if Khrushchev had simply followed Gast's advice? Share your thoughts below.